Hi everyone! My name is Amy, and this video will talk about the biological basis of behavior, and specifically, how neurons fire and how they communicate with each other. Zooming into the brain, we can see that it's made of a whole bunch of different layers of tissue. And each of these layers of tissue will all serve a different function, whether it be containing different parts of a neuron, or neurons that communicate between different brain areas, or up and down different levels in these layers. But the important thing is that your brain is going to be made up of both glial cells, which are kind of support cells, and the neurons, which are going to be doing the communicating. And they do this communicating by firing electrical impulses, which then cause them to release neurotransmitters at the end. And this is how they can kind of act on one another. This is a picture of a basic neuron, but it's important to know that neurons come in a variety of shapes and sizes based on the function they're supposed to serve. So these arrows are pointing at dendrites, which are kind of like tree branches or branches coming off of the cell body or soma. And some cells will have tons of these branches and some very few. And it all depends on what sort of connections or function they're supposed to do. Next, this long strip is called the axon, which is going to be sending down an action potential, and then finally these terminal endings, which are going to be releasing neurotransmitters. This little gray box is called the axon hillock, and it's important for collecting all of the electrical impulses that come in through the dendrites, and then deciding whether or not to fire an action potential. And these little pink circles that I'm putting around the axon, these are going to be pieces called myelin sheath. And these are very important for insulating the axon in order to allow for signals to travel for long distances. And it's made up of this fatty tissue that sort of serves an insulating purpose and protects the signal of the cell. And in the central nervous system, this myelin sheath is made from oligodendrocytes, which wrap around and create this, and that in your peripheral nervous system, this is made from Schwann cells. And finally, the little gaps in between this myelin sheath of exposed axon are called the nodes of Ranvier, and they helped to allow for the signal to kind of propagate and regenerate, kind of jump down the axon in order to maintain that signal while it travels through those little insulated pieces. When neurons interact with each other, they cause changes in the electrical potential of different parts of the neuron. So in this case, if another neuron was interacting with this one, it would cause a change in this neuron's cell membrane in their dendrites and will cause electrical activity to flow into the neuron, and then it's all going to collect in this region called the axon hillock. And the axon hillock serves a really important role in that it decides whether or not to fire an action potential down the axon of the neuron. And if the activity coming into the neuron reaches a special threshold, then it will decide to fire. And this activity will spread down the axon and into the terminal endings, which then causes the release of neurotransmitter. And we can zoom into the graph of this and talk about it in a little bit more detail. When your neuron's at rest, the inside of the cell is going to be more negative than the outside, and the resting membrane potential is about -70. Then, if your neuron reaches enough electrical activity, this threshold is -55, and it causes some pretty cool changes to happen. Specifically, you're going to get sodium channels in the membrane of your neuron opening up and causing sodium to flood into the cell. And this makes the cell super positive on the inside, and this is called depolarization. Then, those channels close and the potassium channels open, causing potassium to flow out of the cell, making your cell more negative again. And it usually way overcompensates for this, and that's called hyperpolarization, which then requires a sodium-potassium pump to pump it back up to its resting membrane potential of -70 by sending 3 sodium out and bringing 2 potassium in. And this action potential is going to propagate within those nodes of Ranvier, and then the signal is going to just spread through those pieces of myelin if it's a myelinated axon. all the way down to the end, or the terminal buttons or terminal endings if you want to call them, where the electrical activity spreads and will cause the release of neurotransmitter. Now, how it can release neurotransmitter is this electrical activity spreading will depolarize the membrane and cause calcium to come into the cell. And this calcium causes a whole bunch of changes to happen in your neuron that causes the creation of these little vesicles of neurotransmitter and causes them to move right to the end of the neuron. And once these move to the end, they can be released into what's called the synaptic cleft. And once it's in the synaptic cleft, it can interact with another neuron on the other side, which would be either a dendrite, or sometimes these connections can happen in other areas. But then, depending on what that neurotransmitter is supposed to do, it can cause changes in the membrane of the other neuron, and these changes can make the other neuron more likely to fire or less likely to fire. So let's say this neuron is receiving a whole bunch of positive signal coming in, and the axon hillock decides that it's enough to fire, and then this neuron is going to release a neurotransmitter. Now, what this neurotransmitter is going to do to the other neuron is it's going to decrease the membrane potential of that neuron, making it more negative. And when the membrane is more negative, this is called an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, because it's going to make this neuron less likely to fire. Or, in some cases, if it receives a whole bunch of negative impulses, the neuron won't fire at all. So alternatively, if that neuron is going to get a whole bunch of electrical activity saying that it's okay, that it can fire, and it releases a neurotransmitter that is an excitatory neurotransmitter, the changes that it causes in the other neuron's membrane are going to be positive changes, so it's going to increase the potential. And when this potential increases, if there are enough increases, then the action potential will fire because the axon hillock has met that threshold. So excitatory neurotransmitters are going to make an action potential more likely to fire, whereas inhibitory postsynaptic potentials are going to make a neuron less likely to fire because they're decreasing the membrane potential. Each neuron will receive multiple inputs, whether they be excitatory or inhibitory, and then each neuron will release one type of neurotransmitter. So when neurons fire together, they get better at communicating with each other. So this neuron, for example, if it's turned on a whole bunch of times and it sends a lot of action potentials, both neurons are going to become more efficient at sending these impulses and doing their job. This could mean that they need less input in order to fire, or that the other neuron is going to be better at taking up the neurotransmitter so that it can fire as well in response to that other neuron. Alternatively, when certain neurons don't fire very often, then they can become less efficient at doing their job. So this could mean that they release less neurotransmitter over time, or the other neuron doesn't pick up their neurotransmitter as quickly, and this can happen for a variety of reasons, but these changes are important for learning. And even during different parts of life, different stages that your brain will go through, losing certain connections are also really important too. So how our neurons fire and what connections they make are really important for how we learn, how we perceive, how we think, and in general, how we understand our world. Our brains are pretty adaptable, and this is why if we work hard and try to overcome challenges, we can actually get better and improve on our physical abilities and also our mental abilities. And these changes and adaptations in our behavior and ability are really starting from the biological level. And this is why it's really important that we have a growth mindset, but we can talk about that in a different video. My name is Amy, and thanks for listening.